The day my brother told me I was greedy for asking what our grandfather had left me. He was wearing Grandpa's watch. That was the part that stayed. Not his voice. Not the lawyer's careful face. Not my aunt's fake sadness or the stale smell of conference room coffee or the way rain blurred the parking lot outside the probate office window. Just the watch. Gold face. Brown leather strap. Slight scratch near the clasp from where Grandpa used to catch it on the workbench in his garage whenever he forgot to take it off before fixing something. My brother had taken it off Grandpa's wrist before the earth over the grave had fully settled. And there he was, in a navy suit that looked too expensive for the kind of grief he was pretending to have. Calling me greedy while wearing a dead man's time. My name is Caroline Bennett. The man who taught me how to change a tire, balance a checkbook, sharpen a kitchen knife, and tell the difference between silence and cowardice was my grandfather, Walter Bennett. The man who sat across from me in that probate office and acted like I was trying to rob the family by asking for what Grandpa had promised me was my older brother, Stephen. And the moment he told me I didn't deserve a penny, something inside me went quiet in a way that only happens when hurt stops asking to be misunderstood and starts becoming evidence. If this story reaches into something old in you, subscribe now. Some betrayals are not about money. Money is just the object small people use to reveal what they were already willing to do. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, in a red brick split-level house at the end of a cul-de-sac where every family looked respectable from the sidewalk and slightly more exhausted once you crossed the threshold. Our front yard was too small for the size of my father's lawn care ambitions. He edged that grass like it owed him money. My mother kept potted ferns on the porch and seasonal wreaths on the door and believed deeply in the moral power of appearances. We were not loud people. We were the kind of family that used thank you notes, church attendance, and holiday casseroles to disguise the deeper mechanics of favoritism. My father, Douglas, managed a regional auto parts warehouse and came home every night smelling faintly like cardboard, engine oil, and burnt coffee. My mother, Sandra, taught second grade for 23 years and had the sort of face people instantly trusted because they mistook composure for kindness. She was organized, capable, well-liked, and emotionally stingy in ways that never looked dramatic enough to outsiders to qualify as cruelty. Then there was my brother, Stephen, 4 years older. Louder laugh. Stronger handshake. The kind of face older women called handsome because they had already decided his carelessness was charm and his entitlement was confidence. Stephen had the easiest job in our family, which was to be male and first. That combination does most of the labor for a person if the family system is built correctly for him. He could forget, fail, drift, restart, apologize badly, borrow irresponsibly, and still be described as having potential. Potential is the word families use for sons when they need to convert repeated evidence into future optimism. I was the opposite type. The daughter who remembered things. The daughter who noticed when bills were due, when birthdays were coming, when the dog was limping, when my mother's silence meant anger and my father's silence meant surrender. I was the useful child, the reliable one, the girl adults praise because they can put weight on her without first asking if she can carry it. Useful girls learn early that being trusted and being loved are not always the same thing. The one person in my family who never confused the two was my grandfather, Walter. Grandpa lived 15 minutes away in an old white house with a sagging porch and a detached garage that smelled like sawdust, motor oil, coffee grounds, and the clean metallic scent of tools wiped down properly after use. He had broad hands, a slow voice, and the kind of eye contact that makes a child feel visible without being performed at. He was my mother's father. Though if you met them together for 5 minutes, you would understand immediately that whatever made him generous had passed over her in favor of discipline. He ran a small plumbing and repair business for 40 years and spent the second half of his life fixing things for people who either could not afford to pay him or were too proud to ask for free help. He loved routines, strong coffee, country ham, yellow legal pads, baseball on the radio. He never raised his voice unless he was trying to save someone from dropping something heavy on their foot. And he treated competence as a form of respect. He also liked me. That sounds simple. It was not. Children know the difference between being tolerated, managed, praised, and liked. Grandpa liked me, not because I was easy, because I paid attention, because I listened, because when he explained how to patch drywall or reset a tripped breaker or compare 3 quotes before hiring someone for a roof, I wanted the why underneath the how. Stephen liked Grandpa in the shallower way. Charming men often like practical older men. As audience, as resource, as backup dignity. When Stephen was 20 and had already burned through 1 semester of community college and 2 job opportunities, he liked sitting on Grandpa's porch, drinking free beer and talking big about real estate, flipping houses, entrepreneurship, and how conventional people never understood risk. Grandpa would listen with half his attention and say things like, "Risk is just gambling if you don't know the numbers." Stephen always laughed that off. Because men like him hear wisdom only if it flatters the version of themselves they already prefer. Grandpa and I became closer after my grandmother died. I was 19 then. Home from college for a long weekend. The funeral flowers still fresh in the living room. Every adult in the family moving around grief as if it were a tray they did not want to spill in public. My mother cried elegantly. My father carried folding chairs. Stephen disappeared for 3 hours after the service and came back smelling faintly of whiskey and somebody else's cologne. I stayed with Grandpa after everyone left and helped him wash dishes in a kitchen that suddenly sounded too empty. He stood at the sink in his rolled-up sleeves, shoulders somehow both solid and smaller than they had ever looked to me, and said, without turning, "Everybody leaves work for later after a funeral. You know what happens then?" I dried a plate and asked, "What?" "The work waits." He said, "Grief does too. Best learn to carry both." That became one of his core philosophies. Carry both. Love and resentment. Duty and anger. Hope and realism. He did not believe life offered neat compartments to emotionally tidy people. Over the next decade, I was the one who visited regularly, not out of sainthood, out of rhythm. Saturday coffee, grocery runs, prescription pickups, fixing the porch screen, helping with tax files, listening to the same old stories about early plumbing jobs in neighborhoods that no longer looked anything like themselves. Stephen came too, but only in seasons. When he needed something, when a relationship ended, when cash got tight, when he wanted to tell somebody his current plan before it failed and became embarrassing. Grandpa never turned him away. That was his flaw. Not softness, exactly. A stubborn loyalty to the idea that blood should have more chances than evidence justified. My mother admired that about him, when it benefited the family image, and resented it when it involved actual material risk. By the time I was 30, my life looked ordinary in the best way. I worked as operations manager for a regional nonprofit housing organization. The job was unglamorous and full of spreadsheets. Contractors, grant deadlines, maintenance schedules, board reports, and emergency repairs that somehow always happened on Fridays. I liked it because systems calm me. Because broken things with solvable causes make more sense than people who pretend not to know what they're doing. I rented a second-floor apartment with 2 little closet space and just enough sunlight. I had a boyfriend for 3 years named Mark Kind. Decent. Dull in a morally healthy way. And when that relationship ended, it ended cleanly enough that I did not have to spend a year excavating my own dignity from the wreckage. Not every ending has to become content. Some just become memory and a different mattress arrangement. Stephen, meanwhile, did what Stephen always did, drifted upward through personality and sideways through consequence. He sold boats for a while, then insurance, then went into property investment with a friend whose last name he mentioned too often, which is always a bad sign in men trying to borrow credibility. He married young, divorced fast, dated loudly, bought a truck he could not afford, moved in with a woman who sold handmade candles online, moved out, moved again, and still somehow remained. In my mother's language, the child we worry about. Not the child who causes worry. The child we worry about. That framing matters. It makes indulgence feel like compassion instead of habit. Then Grandpa got sick. Not all at once. That would have been too clear. First it was fatigue. Then forgetting where he left things. Then weight loss masked by everyone pretending he was just eating lighter. Then a hospital stay for what was supposed to be dehydration, and turned into imaging and then into the quiet. Careful tone doctors use when they know a family is about to become 2 separate groups, the ones who already understand and the ones still bargaining with weather. Pancreatic cancer. Advanced. Not impossible. Not in the technical sense. But late enough that every conversation after diagnosis carried the shape of time as a visible object in the room. The hospital smelled like overbrewed coffee, hand sanitizer, heated blankets, and that low-grade dread all serious illness wards seemed to emit no matter what air freshener the administration buys in bulk. Grandpa hated it. He hated gowns, waiting, dependence, the television mounted too high on the wall, and the way everyone started speaking softer as if volume itself might accelerate disease. I went almost every day after work. My mother came when she could manage it around school and her own emotional comfort threshold. My father came because my mother came. Stephen showed up with flowers once. A better jacket than usual. And exactly the kind of solemn face he uses when he understands something important is happening and wants to be seen understanding it. He sat by Grandpa's bed and said, "You know I'm here for whatever you need." That line should have been fine. The problem was, Stephen always said it at moments when presence could still be mistaken for character. Grandpa looked at him and nodded. I looked out the window and did what women like me always do in rooms where men are being credited for intentions they have not yet had to survive. I remembered the unpaid loan from 2 years earlier, the tools borrowed and never returned. The weekend Grandpa spent fixing a leak in Stephen's condo because Stephen had claimed he was completely slammed and then posted photos from a lake party 12 hours later. I remembered who actually knew Grandpa's medication list. Who had the spare house key? Who knew which drawer the insurance papers were in? Memory is not bitterness. Sometimes it is the only witness you have. About 6 weeks after the diagnosis, Grandpa asked me to bring him his legal folder from the hall cabinet at home. The house smelled different by then. Less coffee, more medicinal cream, heating pad fabric, and the closed window stillness of old age under treatment. I found the folder in the top cabinet exactly where he said it would be. Between an envelope labeled taxes and another labeled home-ins. That was Grandpa. Order as a survival mechanism. I brought it to the hospital and sat while he flipped through pages with hands that looked suddenly too thin for the rest of him. He asked me to read out the names of his accounts, his insurance information, the deed on the house, and the attorney's business card tucked into the side pocket. Then he said, "You know what's in here better than your mother does?" I smiled a little. That's not exactly shocking. "No," he said. "It isn't." There was a pause. Then he asked, "If something happens to me before I sort everything the way I want, would you know who not to trust?" That question landed like cold water. Not because I didn't know, because he did. I looked at him over the bed rail and said, "Stephen." Grandpa shut his eyes briefly, then nodded once. "I love him," he said. "That's separate." That sentence has stayed with me for years, because it is one of the only adult formulations of family I completely trust. I love him. That's separate. Separate from what he does. Separate from what he is capable of. Separate from what he should be handed just because loving him is painful. That is wisdom most parents never earn. He asked me to call his attorney, Margaret Klein. I did. She came 2 days later. Neat gray suit. Practical shoes. Soft voice. No nonsense. The meeting was private except for me, because Grandpa asked me to stay. My mother was offended by that later in the strange, brittle way only daughters can be when their fathers trust the granddaughter's clarity over their own need to feel central. Margaret reviewed everything. Will. Accounts. House. Small investment portfolio. A parcel of undeveloped land outside town that Grandpa had never sold because he liked the idea that some things should remain unoptimized. Nothing in the estate was enormous by national standards. But in our world it was meaningful. The house alone had appreciated more than anyone in the family wanted to say aloud. The land had value. The accounts were solid. More importantly, everything had story attached to it. That was what Stephen wanted most. Not just money. Moral ownership of being the son-like figure around whom the family could organize the legacy narrative. Grandpa's instructions were specific. The house to be sold unless one of us wanted to buy out the others at fair value. A fixed bequest to the church and to a local technical scholarship fund. Equal cash distribution between his 3 children. A separate bequest to me from a brokerage account he had opened after Grandma died. Not enormous. Not symbolic either. Enough to matter. And then the land parcel. That was the complication. He wanted it sold, and the proceeds split equally between me and Stephen. Not because he earned half. Grandpa said. Margaret looked up over her glasses. Then why? Because he'll call it favoritism if I don't. That line told me everything about how clearly he saw my brother. Not as noble. As Noisu. He was trying to prevent conflict after death with fairness measured in strategy. Not sentiment. Margaret documented everything. Asked him twice to restate the land instructions. He did. Clearly. Firmly. I heard it myself. That matters. Because what happened later would have made me doubt my own mind if I had not. When the meeting ended, Grandpa looked tired but relieved. Margaret packed her case and said she'd have the revised documents prepared by the end of the week. Then she touched my arm lightly and said, "Stay involved." I remember that too. Not help him. Not support the family. Stay involved. Lawyers only say that when they smell the future wearing a familiar face. The revised will was signed 3 days later. I was there. Margaret was there. A nurse served as witness because hospitals are full of deeply strange legal logistics people treat as ordinary once illness enters the room. Grandpa's signature shook but held. He looked at me after the last page and said, "Good. Now nobody gets to tell a different story." That sentence would have been beautiful if it had been true. He died 19 days later. Rain all afternoon. The kind of spring rain that makes parking lots shine and funeral clothes smell faintly damp by evening. My mother cried quietly. My father looked like he had been punched in the chest but was trying to remain available to everyone else's practical needs. Stephen wept in full public profile. Which should have made me suspicious, but at the time only made me tired. Grief is not a lie detector. It just lowers your defenses for people already rehearsing their roles. The funeral was crowded. Grandpa had fixed too many things for too many people to leave a small room behind. Plumbers, church members, old neighbors, teachers, men in work jackets, women with casseroles, people with real stories, real gratitude. Stephen gave a eulogy that was almost good enough to be cruel. He spoke about loyalty, family, work ethic, backbone. He spoke like a man trying to drape himself in someone else's values long enough to leave the room wearing them. Afterward, 3 different people told him Walter would have been proud. That should have made me angry. It didn't. It made me alert. Because when a mediocre man starts getting mistaken for a good dead one, you are rarely far from paperwork trouble. The probate meeting happened 12 days later. Conference room. Rain again. Coffee too old to be called coffee, honestly. A humming vent overhead. Margaret at one end of the table. Papers arranged with the kind of precision that made me trust her more than any family member in the room. My mother beside my father. Stephen across from me. He was wearing Grandpa's watch. That is where this started. Margaret began calmly. Review of distributions. House. Brokerage account. Charitable gifts. Land per sale. Everything went fine until the land. Then Stephen leaned back, folded one leg over the other, and said, casually, "I'm not sure that provision reflects Grandpa's actual intention." The room went still. Margaret looked up. "It reflects the executed will." Stephen shrugged. There were a lot of conversations near the end. There is no sentence in family inheritance disputes that has ever improved a room after the words "near the end." I sat very still. Margaret asked, "Are you suggesting lack of capacity?" Stephen gave the exact smile he always gives before pretending reasonableness. "I'm suggesting he was under a lot of influence." There it was. Not even subtle. My mother inhaled sharply. My father closed his eyes. Because they knew, maybe not the scope yet, but enough to feel the shape of it. Margaret's voice cooled. "Mr. Bennett." The will was witnessed properly. Stephen folded his hands. "I'm just saying Grandpa was emotional about Caroline. Everyone knows that." That sentence carried years. Not just greed. Gender. Family architecture. The useful granddaughter suddenly translated into the dangerous favorite. I heard myself say, What exactly are you accusing me of? Stephen turned to me as if this were regrettable. I'm saying you were always around. You handled his papers. You pushed a lot in those final weeks. Maybe he felt pressured. There are moments when the room reveals what your brother has always believed about you. Not that you are controlling, that your competence becomes suspicious the second it threatens his entitlement. Margaret intervened. That is a serious allegation. Stephen spread his hands. I'm asking for fairness. Fairness. He had already decided the word greedy would sound ugly on him, so he handed it to me preemptively. The rest of the meeting became procedural. Margaret said the executed document would stand unless formally challenged. Stephen said perhaps it should be. My mother asked if this was really necessary. My father said, quietly, Stephen, don't. Stephen looked at all of us with the injured certainty of a man who has been told no for the first time in too long. Then he turned to me and said the line that changed everything. You don't need that money the way I do. It's greedy to take half. Need. As if inheritance is welfare? As if Grandpa's wishes were a needs-based committee hearing? As if Stephen's more chaotic life entitled him to a greater share of the final evidence of an old man's intent? I looked at the watch on his wrist, then at him, and something inside me stopped trying. Not stopped caring. Stopped trying to be understood inside a frame already built to convert my restraint into selfishness and his appetite into hardship. I said, very calmly, take that watch off. Everyone stared at me. Stephen blinked. What? That watch belonged to Grandpa, and you don't get to call me greedy while wearing time you stole before probate even closed. That line landed hard enough to change the air pressure in the room. My mother whispered my name. My father stared at the table. Stephen actually laughed. Not because he found it funny, because small men laugh when the truth arrives in a sentence too clean to argue with on the spot. Margaret said, I think we should pause. She was right. Because the next stage was no longer about grief. It was about war in family handwriting. Margaret was right. The pause became a month, then 2, then 7. If you've never watched a family turn a dead man's wishes into a campaign, let me tell you how it happens. Not with one dramatic courtroom scene. With calls, rumors, concerned relatives, aunts who begin sentences with, I hate to say this, but parents who ask whether maybe there's room for compromise. And one entitled sibling who keeps saying fairness in the exact tone selfish people use when they need morality to launder appetite. Stephen did challenge the land provision. Not the full will. That would have been too risky, and too expensive, and too easy to lose publicly. Just the part that bothered him most. The part where Grandpa had made one thing impossible to narrate away, that I mattered enough to be named separately and specifically. The legal argument was dressed in all the usual respectable fabric. Undue influence. Emotional dependency. Late life vulnerability. Concerns about pressure. The first time I read those words in a filing, I laughed so hard I scared myself. Not because it was funny. Because if I did not laugh, I was going to throw the pages across my apartment and begin screaming in a register the ceiling fan had never heard from me before. Undue influence. That phrase sat there in 12-point type like a little tombstone for every practical Saturday I had spent driving Grandpa to appointments, fixing online banking issues, buying groceries, changing smoke detector batteries, and listening to the same old stories, because that is what love looks like when it's not decorative. My brother had called irregular visits, borrowed money, and posturing on the porch family loyalty. I had called up the pharmacy. Apparently one of those things now sounded more suspicious to the law. Margaret remained steady. That woman was worth every billable hour and every start-sharp sentence she ever spoke on my behalf. She explained the filing, the likely process, the weaknesses in his case, and the fact that while his challenge was ugly, it was not as strong as he wanted it to look. Grandpa had been clear, witnessed, reaffirmed, specific. Stephen's problem was not that he lacked grievance language. It was that he lacked facts. But facts take time. And time, in estate disputes, is not neutral. Time costs money, energy, sleep, dignity. It also creates opportunities for relatives to start framing the woman who won't yield as the one dragging things out. That happened by week 3. My Aunt Linda called first woman. Always her. Voice soft as flannel and twice as irritating. "Honey, I'm not taking sides," she began. Which of course meant she was. "I just worry that this kind of stress would break your grandfather's heart." I was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. "That's interesting," I said, "because I worry that my brother accusing me of manipulating Grandpa while wearing his watch would have done the same." She got quiet. "Good." Then she said, "You know Stephen's under a lot of pressure?" There it was. The family religion. Male pressure as universal solvent. Pressure dissolves debts. Pressure dissolves accountability. Pressure dissolves greed and rebrands it as hardship. I said, "Then he should stop creating more of it," and ended the call. My mother tried next. Not directly. Never directly at first. She invited me for lunch. Said we all needed to sit down, without legal language in the room. That phrase alone told me the lunch was designed to do what the filing hadn't, move me off the documented truth and back into the family system, where my role was to preserve comfort at my own expense. I said no. She sounded hurt. "Caroline, I don't understand why you're being so rigid." Rigid. Such a useful word. When women refuse to bend, people always describe the shape of their spine, like it's the problem. I'm not being rigid. I said, I'm being consistent. That answer made her angry in a way only accuracy can. "You know your grandfather wouldn't have wanted this." I looked out my apartment window at a line of bare trees shaking in October wind, and thought how strange it was that the only people claiming to channel Grandpa so confidently after his death were the ones most actively trying to overturn his actual signature. "No." I said, "You mean Stephen wouldn't have wanted this?" We didn't speak for 3 weeks after that. My father called on the 4th. He used the same voice he had used my entire life whenever he wanted justice to happen quietly enough that nobody had to feel guilty on purpose. "Couldn't you two just split it differently?" That question told me everything. Not can Stephen stop lying. Not can your mother stop enabling him. Not can we all tell the truth and then move from there. Just split it differently. Give up enough so the room can breathe again. That is what daughters like me are always asked to do. Make breathing room out of our own losses. I said, "Dad, he's not asking for fairness. He's testing whether shame still works on me." Long silence. Then, almost sadly, I don't like who this is making everyone become. That sentence nearly made me scream. Because men like my father always describe other people's choices as weather, when naming the chooser would require more courage than they have budgeted for the week. This isn't making Stephen become anything, I said. It's just giving him paperwork. He had no answer. Margaret filed the response. Attached notes from the hospital meeting. Witness statements. Grandpa's revised instructions. A timeline. Documentation that showed exactly what I had been doing in those final weeks, and exactly how often Stephen had not been there. Not because absence alone proves bad faith. Because the contrast matters. When someone builds a moral narrative around presence he never actually sustained. Then came mediation. Mediation is one of those words that sounds civilized until you've sat through it with blood relatives and stale pastries. It took place in a downtown office suite with gray walls, humming vents, and the particular smell all professional compromise spaces share: coffee, copier heat, carpet cleaner, and the thin, exhausted scent of people trying to frame appetite as principle. Stephen arrived in a charcoal suit, and the watch, still the watch, that told me more than any statement could have. He believed symbolism belonged to him because he had already decided no one would really make him give anything back. He smiled when he saw me. That same smile from childhood? The one that always meant he thought adults would still mistake his confidence for innocence. Caroline. No apology. No awkwardness. Just my name. Like we were colleagues in a minor dispute over printer allocation. I sat down and said nothing. That unsettled him more than a speech would have. The mediator went through process. Ground rules. Possibilities. Margaret handled the first round. Stephen's attorney spoke about preserving family harmony and avoiding unnecessary depletion of the estate. Which was a beautiful way of saying my brother would prefer to spend Grandpa's money inheriting from Grandpa to prevent me from receiving Grandpa's money from Grandpa. Then Stephen spoke for himself. That was the mistake. He said, I just think it's obvious who was influencing him more at the end. I looked at him. Do you want to define influencing? He shrugged. You were always there. Yes. I said, that's usually what happens when someone actually shows up. The mediator winced. Margaret almost smiled. Stephen's attorney intervened. But the damage was done. Because once Stephen moved from legal framing into ordinary speech, he sounded exactly like what he was, a man furious that consistency had left a record he could not compete with retroactively. The mediation failed. Of course it did. You cannot mediate someone out of believing. Proximity entitles him to what a dead man chose otherwise. The court upheld the will. That is the clean version. The long version is affidavits, delays, hearings, invoices, and the humiliating experience of having to prove that caring for your grandfather was not a financial strategy. But in the end, the challenge failed. The land was sold. The proceeds were split exactly as Grandpa directed, and Stephen stopped speaking to me. Not in a dramatic, excommunicative way. In the lazy, punishing way entitled men often go silent when the woman they expected to fold doesn't. He blocked my number. Told relatives I had turned Grandpa's death into a transaction. My mother said she was staying neutral, which in family language means she continued having full access to him while asking me to be patient with his pain. My father became gentler and more absent, which is the male version of moral retreat. I took the money, not because it made me rich, Because it was mine. That distinction mattered. More than the amount. More than the legal victory. It was the first time in my adult life I understood that accepting what is rightfully yours is not greed merely because someone louder wants it more publicly. I used part of the money to pay off the last of my student loans. Part went into savings. And the part that surprised everyone, I used as seed capital to buy a neglected duplex with a failing roof and bad bookkeeping through a local affordable housing partnership program. Then another. Then a 4-unit property with terrifying plumbing and a seller too tired to fake confidence. Not glamorous. Not viral. Not cinematic. The kind of work Grandpa would have respected immediately. Maintenance schedules. Vendor negotiations. Tenant issue. Permit headaches. Budget margins. Real roofs. Real water damage. Real people. I got good at it. Then better. The operations work I already knew from the non-profit side, married cleanly with the practical instincts Grandpa had taught me years earlier over coffee. Receipts. And hardware store aisles. By year 3, I left my salaried role and started my own small property management and restoration firm focused on older multifamily housing. By year 5, it was profitable enough that my mother began telling people, with suspiciously polished language, that I had always been entrepreneurial. That made me laugh the first time Aunt Linda reported it back. Because when a daughter succeeds, families often try to retroactively mother outcomes they actively complicated at the start. I did not correct her. Not because she deserved the ease. Because I had stopped needing biographical honesty from people who treated memory like wet clay. Around that time, I met Noah. His name enters this story differently than my brother's, because Noah never tried to take the temperature of a room and then optimize himself for it. He was quiet, the way some men are quiet when they have a full life already and are not auditioning for anyone's rescue fantasy. He was a structural engineer. Divorced for reasons uncomplicated enough to be boring and sad in a mature way. He wore old watches, liked badly brewed diner coffee, and had the kind of hands that make you think he actually fixes things he owns, instead of posting about masculine competence online. We met at a housing coalition event because city work is a deeply unserious ecosystem full of very serious nouns. And he was the only other person at our table making visible eye contact every time a developer said community-centered luxury repositioning. That was enough to start. He asked me to dinner 3 weeks later. Our first date lasted 4 hours, because for the first time in years I was around a man who did not treat my precision like frostiness or my independence like a challenge. I told him about Grandpa on the 3rd date. Not the whole inheritance saga, just the garage, the coffee, the legal pads, the way he explained useful things without making me feel tested. Noah listened and said, "Sounds like he taught you how not to be manipulated by charming incompetence." I laughed so hard I had to put down my fork. That was the first hint I might like him for real. My family met him a year later. My mother approved in the way women like her approve of men who are obviously competent but hard to socially manage. My father liked him because Noah asked direct questions and then let answers exist without decorating them. Stephen did not meet him because by then Stephen and I existed in parallel family universes that occasionally shared a Christmas table if seating arrangements were managed with enough geopolitical care. Years passed. Then 7. That matters. Because revenge stories often get told like time exists only as a hallway between injury and payoff. It doesn't. Time is where most of life happens. Buildings. Tax bills. A leaking water heater on a Tuesday. Noah, moving into my house. A dog we didn't mean to adopt and then absolutely did. My firm growing from practical to respected. My mother learning to ask about properties in a tone halfway between pride and proprietary revisionism. My father getting older. Aunt Linda getting no wiser. Stephen becoming a name that still made the room tighten slightly at holidays, but no longer occupied whole internal landscapes inside me. Then one rainy Thursday in late October, he showed up at my office. No call, no warning. My receptionist buzzed me and said, "Caroline, there's a man here who says he's your brother." I almost said, "Send him away." Almost. Then something in me, not hope. I'm certainly not family loyalty. Just curiosity sharpened by history said no. Let him in. He looked worse than I expected. That is not cruelty. It's observation. Stephen had always carried himself as if momentum itself would save him from accounting. Men like that age strangely once the world stops mistaking charm for structure. He was heavier around the middle, thinner at the hairline, more expensive in the watch than in the face. Still the watch. Of course. He stood in the doorway of my office, clean glass wall. Reclaimed wood desk. Stacks of permit files. One stubborn fiddle-leaf fig I had somehow kept alive through 3 winters, and for 1 second, we were children again. Only in the sense that the old hierarchy tried to rise and couldn't find enough oxygen. Caroline. Just my name. No warmth. No theatrics. Good. I gestured to the chair. What do you want? That startled him. He had expected pleasantries first. Maybe a little shame. Maybe the old female labor of making a difficult moment socially usable. Instead, he got a question. He sat down slowly. The room smelled like rain on concrete, and the coffee my assistant brewed too strong every afternoon. "I need your help," he said. There it was. No detour. No fake interest in my life. Just the ask. Strangely, that made me respect him more in that moment than I had in years. "At least you skipped the weather." He didn't smile. That worried me more than if he had. Because if Stephen wasn't charming, he was either cornered or telling the truth about his degree of cornering. He told me then, in clipped, careful language, that the property investment venture he had built with 2 partners was collapsing. One partner had pulled capital, another had apparently been borrowing against short-term assumptions no one could now defend. Stephen had signed personal guarantees, of course he had, and was facing the kind of cascading pressure that turns confident men into temporary philosophers about fairness and brotherhood and luck. He said he needed a bridge. Not a bailout. Of course. No one with an ego asks family for a bailout while still trying to keep their own face intact. Just a bridge. Some capital. Some introductions. Maybe a temporary partnership structure through one of my entities while he stabilized. I listened. All the way through. Because that is one gift age gives women like me. We stop interrupting. Not because we are gentler, because letting someone finish often exposes more than fighting for the middle ever could. When he was done, I said, "How much?" He told me, it was obscene. Not in absolute market terms. In family terms, because it wasn't just help. It was the amount of money he had once implied I was too selfish to inherit from our grandfather. I sat back in my chair and looked at him. He knew. I could see that he knew. Memory had entered the room, and there was no furniture large enough to hide behind. You practiced this speech? I said. He exhaled. A few times. Did any version include an apology? Silence? There is no sound. I trust more than silence after that question. Because remorseful people answer too quickly. Entitled people need to calculate. Finally, he said, I was wrong about some things. Some things. Such a cowardly little phrase. Not you lied. Not you smeared me. Not you challenged Grandpa's wishes and called me greedy while wearing his watch. Some things. I looked at his wrist, then at him, and said, Take the watch off. He actually recoiled. What? That watch was Grandpa's. You've been using it like a family title for 7 years. Take it off if you want this conversation to continue honestly. For a second, I thought he might leave. Part of me almost wanted him to. But men who need money find moral flexibility quickly when the room is no longer theirs. Slowly, stiffly, he unbuckled the strap and set the watch on my desk. It made a tiny sound against the wood, more satisfying than it should have been. That was the moment the conversation became real. Not because I wanted the watch, because he had finally given something up without first pretending he was doing me a favor. Then I said, Start over. He looked exhausted suddenly. Not dramatic. Just older. And when he started again, the speech was different. Shorter. Less polished. He admitted the challenge to Grandpa's will had been about resentment as much as money. That he had always thought I was the child adults trusted too much. That by the time Grandpa got sick, he'd convinced himself my closeness to him was a strategy rather than what it really was, consistency. He admitted he had expected me to fold because I always used to make family easier for everyone else. That line landed hardest. Because it was true. Not the strategy part. The folding part. He had built half his life around the assumption that I would keep yielding once the room got uncomfortable enough. I asked, Do you know why I stopped? He shook his head. Because Grandpa was the last person in this family who never confused my reliability with obligation? He looked down. Then, in the smallest voice I had ever heard from my brother, he said, I think I hated that. That was as close to a confession as Stephen was structurally capable of producing. Type karma if you think some people only understand your value once they need access to it. Not because revenge fixes the past. Because clarity feels holy after years of being mislabeled. I did not fund his deal. Let's get that out of the way cleanly. This is not a story about me writing a check and becoming the saintly sister who transcends the family system through grace. That ending would have felt tidy and false and disrespectful to everything Grandpa ever taught me about numbers. I asked questions, requested documents, reviewed the structure. Had Noah look at the guarantees and 2 of my advisors review the partnership risk? The answer came back exactly as I expected. Not impossible. Just badly built and too late. The kind of rescue that turns the rescuer into the next person holding the bag. So I offered Stephen something else. Not money. Terms. I would connect him with a restructuring attorney and 1 lender contact who might buy him time. I would not join the deal. I would not absorb his guarantees. I would not mortgage the future of my company to soothe the present consequences of his arrogance. He stared at me, like he wasn't sure whether to call that kindness or revenge. It's the most help I've ever offered you, I said, and less than you want. Both things can be true. He laughed then. One tired, defeated sound. Grandpa would have loved that line. I looked at the watch still lying on my desk. Yes, I said, he would have. Then I slid it back toward him. He didn't take it. That surprised me. After a long pause, he said, I think you should keep it. For a second, I didn't move. Because objects become dangerous when they carry too much restoration fantasy. I did not want the watch as a trophy. I did not want it as proof I had finally beaten him. I wanted nothing from Stephen that came disguised as atonement, but still smelled like collapse. So I asked, why? His answer was the most honest one he gave all day. Because every time I wore it, I told myself it meant he would have chosen me if he'd had more time. There it was. The whole ugly child logic underneath 7 years of adult behavior. Not money. Selection. He had needed the watch because it was easier than tolerating the fact that Grandpa had seen him clearly and loved him anyway, without rewarding him for it materially. I took the watch, not because I forgave him, because Grandpa would have hated the object being used as self-deception any longer. Stephen left 40 minutes later with an attorney name, a lender contact, no check, and a look on his face I had never seen before. Not shame exactly. Not relief. Recognition. The kind that changes how a person stands when they finally understand the woman they kept calling difficult is simply the only one in the family who stopped confusing love with surrender. The fallout was predictable in structure, if not in intensity. My mother called within 2 days. How she found out what had happened so quickly remains one of those mysteries no family ever pretends not to understand. Her first sentence was, I heard Stephen came to see you. I stood in my kitchen holding the watch for the first time alone and looked out at my backyard where the dog was failing to understand leaves. Yes? A pause. Then, I hope you helped him. That sentence clarified the entire architecture of my childhood in under 7 words. Not what happened. Not are you okay. Not how was that for you after everything. Just I hope you helped him. The useful child, recalled to function. I smiled. She couldn't see it. I did. Relief entered her voice instantly. Oh, good. Then I said, just not in the way he wanted. That changed her tone immediately. Caroline? There is so much accusation in a mother using your full name after the age of 35. He asked me to underwrite his mistakes. He's in trouble. He was in trouble when he challenged Grandpa's will. That's not the same. It's exactly the same. I said. He just thought the room would save him again. She exhaled sharply. What happened to this family? That question almost made me laugh. Nothing happened to it. That was the whole problem. It had always functioned this way. I had simply stopped paying the hidden costs quietly enough for everyone else to keep calling it balance. No, I said. What happened is I stopped doing your side of the emotional work. We didn't speak for a month after that. My father called once during the silence and said, in that same old tired tone, your mother doesn't understand your boundaries. I answered, she understands them. She just doesn't like not outranking them. That was one of the few times in my life, he laughed briefly. Ruefully, like a man hearing the truth come from his daughter, in a shape he had avoided giving it his whole life. Stephen did use the attorney. Did get time from the lender? Did lose 1 property and save 2? We did not become close. That matters. Not every family story should end in reunion. That is one of the most manipulative myths ever sold to daughters. Healing is not proven by how much proximity you reallow. Sometimes it is proven by how calmly you refuse. A year later, he sent me a Christmas card. No message inside except, "I'm trying to learn the difference between being forgiven and being trusted." That was the first sentence from him I ever kept. Not because it erased anything, because it suggested, finally, the beginning of adult thought. As for the land money, the company, the watch, the years in between, people still ask if I think Grandpa would be proud. I don't spend much time on that question anymore. Not because it doesn't matter. Because pride is too small a category for what I think he wanted. He didn't want admiration. He wanted accuracy. He wanted his work, his choices, his love, and his limits named correctly after he was gone. He wanted his granddaughter not to disappear under the noise of a grandson who believed need should always outrank integrity. And maybe most of all, he wanted me not to mistake family access for family wisdom. My brother took my share of our grandfather's inheritance and called me greedy. 7 years later, he showed up asking for my help. People hear that sentence and imagine the whole story is in the ask. It isn't. The story is in the years before it, in becoming the kind of woman who can look at someone who hurt her, read the numbers, understand the risk, remember the damage, and still decide from clarity instead of old shame. That was the inheritance. Not the land. Not the brokerage account. Not the house. The inheritance was judgment. And judgment, properly taught, is worth more than whatever your family first tried to steal with paper. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are more of us than anyone admits. The daughters who remembered everything. The sisters who got called difficult for refusing to subsidize male chaos emotionally or financially. The women who had to learn late that being reliable does not make you responsible for rescuing everyone who mistook your reliability for weakness. And if that's you, remember this. You do not owe full access to the people who only come back when your strength becomes useful. Sometimes the strongest ending is not revenge. It is terms. It is documents. It is letting someone sit in the consequences of a story they wrote about you until they finally realize you stopped reading from their version years ago. My brother showed up asking for help. I gave him structure. I kept the watch. And for the first time since our grandfather died, time belonged to the right person again.